experience conducting research on the integration of anticipatory action international systems. I started doing this in 2022 when WFP asked me to evaluate the impact of their system buildings intervention on government capacities to do anticipatory action for drought specifically in Southern Africa. All these case studies are available online. If you just click Building Systems for Drought WFP, you'll find them. And I've also done it for Bangladesh for them. So I will share data on how to measure capacities for anticipatory action of governments, common challenges and trends that come up across the countries I've done my research in, and also data insights on which actions by government partners, such as NGOs, but also auxiliaries to the government, have had actual impact on strengthening capacities, and what are they doing to make sure those capacities are retained and maintained sustainably over time. Your input across the session will be really important. So I will sandwich these moments of giving you information with questions from your side. The point of this session is to get the pulse of the anticipatory action community on this theme of government-led anticipatory action. And the results of your interaction will be used at the Global Dialogue Platform in Berlin and presented and discussed further. To understand also well what is the consensus of the community on supporting government-led anticipatory action in a session around mainstreaming AA. It's also the opportunity for you and your interactions to shape ongoing research, such as this research project I am doing for the IFRC, which seeks to answer the following questions. To what extent has anticipatory action been integrated into government systems? Are there any champions, governmental champions who are leading on AA? And if so, are their success stories replicable under what conditions? From the perspective of a government system, what is needed to integrate anticipatory action? International systems, what are obstacles preventing them? And what is the role of national societies as auxiliaries to public authorities, but also non-governmental actors to support such integration? So in interacting with me today, you'll be helping to shape as well some of this research that is in early stage. So again, thank you so much for your interest and your participation. Before I kickstart, do you have any expectations for today's session? And I will put a quick timer on this one because we do have a lot to cover today. So if you could just go into the Menti and put in your expectations, that would be great. 30 seconds is maybe a bit short. So I might add more time on this one. Never mind. Cancel countdown. Okay. Experience sharing, great. So I will be sharing experience from different countries, but also asking participants to come in with their examples. New evidence, hear from governments, interesting. Differences and anticipatory action for government and assuming non-government. Learning from other countries, best practices. Great, okay. If you have experience working within government institutions as a government representatives as well, your insights are going to be crucial in shaping today's session. So please feel free to interact with the Menti. Global updates, drought model learning. We'll touch upon that, but I'll look at a multi-hazard. What works? Okay, great. So with no further ado, let's discuss. Before I start by giving you information, quick pulse checking. How would you describe currently in the countries where you work, the current role of government in your country/region when it comes to anticipatory action? So you can use the Menti to disagree or agree with the following statements. Whether the government takes a leading role in driving, coordinating, and framing anticipatory action within national disaster risk management, would you agree or disagree on this scale? Or in your country or region, whether the government collaborates effectively with other organizations as a key partner in anticipatory efforts. This is more consultative. And at a less mature stage, whether the relationship to the government is more national institutions providing inputs when these are required by AA implementers, but overall anticipatory action is mainly driven by NGOs. So take your time to answer that one. This is just also to see what the state of play is in government participation. I also cannot get rid of that blue. Let me see. Unfortunately, I can't get rid of these blue lines that were drawn on by a participant early on. Sorry about that. I'll give it a bit more time for this gal, as less than half people have voted so far. But overall, the strong consensus is more on the third role, where the government is a reactive partner that provides input to anticipatory action when requested or required by partners. And the minority of you have a government taking a leading role. Interesting. So, which then begs the question, okay, so for governments to take a leading role, what do they need? And I rephrase the question here to not just look at anticipatory action, but what do they need to use risk information to anticipate hazards and mitigate these impacts on populations? And I rephrase this because the way humanitarians define anticipatory action and the way governments anticipate hazards have different terminologies, which is why I didn't use AA on this one. So according to this report by the OECD, when you want to effect systems change in the public sector and government sector, government administrations need to develop a vision for desired future outcomes, define principles according to define the principles according to which the future system will operate, and then start to implement a set of interventions that will transform the existing system into the future system. So in our case, we want governments to implement a set of interventions that will shift their disaster risk reduction and management systems from ex post assistance to increasingly ex ante, with layered interventions that occur before, during, and after the disaster to mitigate the impact. Government systems are different to a humanitarian program and pilot. And it's important to understand that, to understand then why governments act the way they do or why they don't act the way we do, perhaps as humanitarians. An overall system is combined of different layers. There's the enabling environment, which refers to the rule of the game. So for instance, these would be your disaster laws and policies that regulate the behaviors and interactions between institutions and individuals. Sorry, again, I don't know where these blue lines are coming from. So that's the enabling environment. You need to act on that to be able to create massive systems change. Then there's the organizational domain, which is, for instance, a given institution, for instance, a National Disaster Risk Management Agency. How are they framed by their procedures, their ways of working, their organizational culture, their geography in tandem with the broader environment? And then there's the individual domain, the skills and knowledge capacities, which you can shift through things like capacity training, sensitization, etc. And to affect systems shift, whether a government or partners to the government, you need to make sure you're acting across these domains. What does that mean concretely when we want to support governments to be able to anticipate hazards? According to the World Food Programme, who researched this in 2023, you need to look at what already exists in country-level systems for disaster risk reduction and see which are the core capacities that need to be strengthened. Again, governments are already implementing anticipatory actions in some way or another, and it might be rigid anticipatory action, but governments are already evacuating in some cases or sending out early warning messages. There are systems and capacities in place to anticipate. But what are core capacities that need to be strengthened to make sure that assistance actually is delivered to populations between the moment the early warning happens and the actual impact. So according to WFP, basically the core capacities that a government needs to strengthen and to have equally strong to be able to do AA are the policy and legislation environment. And here, if you're looking for resources on how to improve policy and legislation environments, I refer you to the disaster law documents by the IFRC, which includes a checklist on what makes a strong disaster law. And then there's everything that has to do with funding. Is funding available? Are funding mechanisms sufficiently flexible? Are they fast enough to make sure that the funds arrive on time and at scale? Everything that has to do with scientific capacity, i.e., the capacity to forecast hazards, monitor them, use risk information and different access to risk information to inform early warning and guide decision making when it comes to anticipatory action. And finally, implementation. Do they have the trucks, the people, the roads, the plans, the coordination to be able to be operationally ready when that trigger threshold is reached? I want to make a key point that this isn't about mirroring completely components of an anticipatory action program. This will look different for every country. These are just wide core capacities that are needed. But depending on each country, some areas might look different. For instance, if you look at finance, public sector finance is regulated very differently from state to state, depending if you have a federal system or a central system, etc. So that's why anticipatory action can't really just be copy pasted into government systems. A quick other pulse checking from you. One of the discrepancies that we have is that sometimes, depending on each context, the understanding of anticipatory action by governments can be more or less easy to get them to familiarize themselves with. And this often has to do with whether a government has experience historically in taking preemptive assistance. So in your country, what are government's understanding of anticipatory action currently? Have they, A, been doing it for a while, even if they don't call it anticipatory action? Or B, do they currently understand the added value of anticipatory action? And this has been done perhaps through advocacy and trainings, but more efforts are needed. Is it C, relatively a new concept to them? Or D, are you unsure about how to respond because it depends how you define anticipatory action, which is also a possibility. So as these questions come along, I'm seeing already that the majority of you are saying that there's increasing understanding or it's a relatively new concept. Now, there are in the literature about defining anticipatory action and making it palatable to governments, there is different positions as to whether anticipatory action is not yet currently understood because it's a relatively new concept, position C, that some of you have chosen, or some people have argued that actually our definition of anticipatory action has been defined through a humanitarian lens, rigidly through humanitarian systems and pilots, which is why then it can't be immediately understood by governments. This is an open-ended question, so please type in the chat box, in the Mentimeter. In your opinion, what is the difference between the humanitarian understanding of anticipatory action and the government understanding of anticipatory action? Particularly if you answered B or C, governments are starting to understand or they do not yet understand because it's a new concept. And I'll give you a bit of time for this one before moving on to the next section. I don't see if people are responding in the Menti or in the chat box.
Nothing on the chat currently.
Okay. Government has a fragmented approach to anticipatory action. Really interesting. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I think governments might target other events, not those with humanitarian impact. So the understanding of what anticipatory action can do differs. Humanitarians connect short-term actions only, while governments connect to long-term and short-term actions. Governments are confused with preparedness. The humanitarian sector is driven by a visible need based on crisis or disaster, but governments are driven by budget allocations or constraints. Already exists in their humanitarian so far focused on pilots. Okay, very interesting so far. So based on those, just to recap as well what the literature is saying, this reflects some of your answers. Um, in the literature, there's polarizing again positions, and there are cases where anticipatory reaction understanding is not yet understood because of gaps in the data. Governments have higher accountability or different accountability systems to humanitarians. They're held accountable by the populations that they serve. They're held accountable by the institutional mandates, by the anti-corruption rules. It's extraordinarily high risk for a government to release funding based on a probability, which then makes it difficult for them if they don't have reliable forecasts. So if the forecasts or the risk data is not available, then anticipatory action becomes difficult, whether led by NGOs or led by governments. There's also the issue of political salience. Indeed, humanitarian organizations are often driven by funded program timings, as some of you rightly mentioned. This also creates fragmentation in the AA sector with project-based anticipatory actions, whereas governments, they are constrained by election influences. And there is some literature that shows that electoral concerns can be a concern by governments. They don't necessarily want, for instance, to spend on a probability if that might influence their re-election cycles, especially because, again, this is huge release of funds. So if you get it wrong, then it becomes very difficult. This is an interesting one. One of you mentioned that governments already have components of anticipatory action in their existing preparedness and response measures, whereas humanitarian so far focused on pilots. So when we look at the data of how anticipatory action programs are currently set up worldwide, thanks to the reports available on Anticipation Hub, we do see that so far, early action protocols, anticipatory action systems or frameworks by OCHA, the RFC STAR, they've been set up as their specific programs with their specific triggers, actions, and finance mechanisms. Whereas governments, when you tell them that you want to set up an early action protocol, etc., they always ask, how does this influence my existing contingency plan? I already have a contingency plan, some of which is based on risk information. So yes, there are already elements. And in some ways, it could be argued that governments themselves are already better at integrating anticipatory action in the DRM continuum than humanitarians, because we focused on testing the pilots in isolation of everything else first to see if it works. So moving on, and then I'll show you some data and insights from my research. Here's some different statements from the literature on positions on different understandings of how anticipatory action should look like if it's scaled up to be effective. And I would like to poll the AA community on where they position themselves with these definitions of anticipatory action, notably when it comes to triggers. So, do you agree that for anticipatory action to be scaled up effectively, there needs to be strict adherence to pre-agreed triggers? And these triggers need to be based on rigorous scientific data and forecasts, because this then ensures timely funding. You take away the human political making decision element. And this is the only way that anticipatory action will work effectively at scale. On the other hand, would you say that for anticipatory action to be scaled up, triggers need to rely not only on data, scientific forecasts, etc., but need to have a human component of decision making, which would align better with political institutions who have the mandate of taking decisions, concerting each other. So the first one is more triggers should be automatic, including governments. They should rely on automatic trigger thresholds. And the second one is more to scale up anticipatory action within government systems. Triggers should combine both automaticity, but also political decision making that is a key factor of institutions. And then the third one is more, well, it's going to be difficult to scale up anticipatory action anyway, because the data makes it difficult to implement a reliable trigger system, whether you based it just on objective data or you include decision making. The majority of you so far agree both that there is a lack of data that make it difficult to implement a reliable trigger system, and this is a key challenge to overcome in most countries, which can be overcome with new initiatives such as the Early Warning for All initiative that is led by UNDRR and WMO, that seeks to strengthen early warning systems across the 4 pillars. So that can be an area of solution. And interestingly, most of the community so far has a slight preference for strict adherence to pre-agreed triggers, which means that the vision would be for governments to shift from political decision-making to adherence to rigorous trigger models with objective forecast and risk data in the way that humanitarians are doing it, for instance. There is some people who vote more for soft triggers, and this can be compared, for instance, to the model that the START network does. Contrarily to like the SURF for the UN, START, when a certain trigger threshold is reached, it activates a decision-making committee at START, and then they decide whether or not to release the funds. Right. Okay, so this is still polarizing statements within the data and literature. There's not yet consensus on here, and this is clearly reflected in your questions. So, to have effective capacity strengthening and institutional change, instead of looking at, okay, how do I make AA and integrate it into existing disaster risk management systems, you kind of have to flip the question on its head and say, okay, what are governments already doing in disaster risk management? And how do those components match requirements for anticipatory action? So again, we know based on available research that no matter the country, these are core capacities that each government will need, and that at some level, each government is doing. So let me give you a concrete example from a research I did in Bangladesh last year, where I interviewed key informants from governments at local and decentralized sector, as well as some A implementers. If you look at the capacities and systems for disaster risk reduction in Bangladesh, on the left side, you have the strong points of the system. So for instance, Bangladesh has really strong forecasting capacities for cyclones and floods. And this has to do with the capacities of the Bangladesh Meteorological Department, as well as the Cyclone Preparedness Program. One of the things that makes Bangladesh particularly ready to anticipate as well is the policy and legislation environment. They've revised their policy and legislation to add ex ante measures, which then enables institutions to take actions ahead of a cyclone. Bangladesh also has a strong culture of anticipating cyclones. They've been doing it since the 1970s, which influences stakeholder and buy-in, obviously. And then if you look at barriers, things that are preventing the Bangladesh system as it currently exists from anticipating and using forecasts to anticipate. Then you have the main barriers have to do with the localization. This has to do with the lack of data, notably when it comes to local level forecast systems for floods. These are still missing and few and far between, and it makes it difficult to trigger very specifically different geographical areas. And while Bangladesh does have some strong institutions for disaster risk management, there is a lack of stakeholder understanding and buy-in from other aspects of the government, notably social protection institutions. So this is one way in which you can visualize what is the existing systems and then reposition the existing systems as to, okay, but would this work to do anticipatory action, or is this something that is preventing the government from doing anticipatory action? Another way of visualizing the same data, if you look at the strong points currently mentioned in Bangladesh's institutional system that would allow them to anticipate. Again, there's the policy and legislation dot. This is the blue dot. Notably, their revision of the Standing Order on Disasters, which is the main framework in Bangladesh for disaster risk management, which under the leadership of the Ministry of Disaster Risk Management was revised to include terminology around anticipatory action, or as they call it over there, forecast-based action. They have strong implementation and operational readiness capacities because they have this cyclone preparedness program, which is a community-based early warning and preparedness program that spans across the entire country, and that is volunteer-based. And this has been quoted as the main factor for reducing casualties from cyclones because it is a strongly rooted community-based early warning system. The community trusts this early warning system. They understand the different flag systems, or if they don't understand that there are volunteers that can interpret the early warnings. This has led Bangladesh to effectively reduce by the millions and the thousands, sorry, the casualties linked to cyclones through anticipatory evacuations and early warnings. And the capacities of the Bangladesh meteorological development has been strengthened across the past 5 years, leading to more reliable forecasts with longer lead times, which also has supported anticipatory action for floods. Now, if we look at measuring the gaps and challenges for institutional systems, and again, I expect some of you are from Bangladesh in the participation, so you might be familiar with this. A common trend is scientific capacities when it comes to localizing triggers, impact-based forecasting. This is common to many countries and maybe a familiar challenge for you as well, is even if you do have meteorological capacities for forecasting and monitoring hazards, how do you then layer that with risk information? And then one of the actions that can be done to strengthen the system is supporting governments in understanding what are the different risk information that is available to them beyond just weather risk information, but also exposure, vulnerability data, data from indigenous knowledge systems, and how can they layer that to understand exactly what the hazard is supposed to have in terms of impact, how can they quantify that in terms of loss and damage. Again, initiatives that can help for that is the early warning system, early warnings for all initiative, particularly pillar 1 that looks at use of risk information. And you can reach out to UNDRR to support governments on that. There's also the Santiago network currently that looks particularly at loss and damage and is meant to be a fund for governments to apply to mitigate and reduce loss and damage related to climate and weather hazards. And so that could be a key opportunity as well to connect risk information to quantifying what would be the potential impact in terms of loss and damage. When you're doing these kind of assessments, when you're trying to understand what are existing capacities for anticipatory action, I just want to give you an example of the informal composition when I did my KAIIs in Bangladesh, which amounted to approximately 50 people. It's important you have an overall representation of the disaster risk management community, which is going to be cross-sectoral. And one thing I want to also push as a key message is if you do decide to do an assessment of capacity in your given country or at your given local region, please make sure that you are talking not just to national governments, but also to local authorities. Because research has shown as well that there's a key entry point there for strengthening systems. Local authorities, they have that connection to communities. They sometimes also have that trust with traditional leaders. So integrating anticipatory action at a smaller level than national systems, but at local systems is something that can be an easy entry point. And you can have more of a bottom-up strategy, for instance, for integrating AA into systems for disaster risk management. You can go from the community-based and then work your way up to larger scale interventions such as policy reform, strengthening of forecasting capacities, etc. That was an example from Bangladesh in terms of strengths and challenges. I'd be interested to know in your context, what are the biggest challenges or barriers that are preventing government leadership and ownership of anticipatory action? Some of you have already mentioned, notably, understanding challenges. Give you a bit of time for that one. Financial implications, yeah. One of the issues that we have as well when we're trying to shift anticipatory action from our humanitarian pilots into large-scale governmental programs, governments want to know what will be the implications for their available funds. If they spend money on a hypothetical, what will be the money available in case there's an emergency response later in the line? And currently, there is not enough research that measures the comparative risk and impact. We do have evidence, of course, on the impact of anticipatory action at household level, and that evidence is being used. But that evidence is packaged from a humanitarian perspective and often used to advocate for more fuel funding for donors. What we're missing is evidence from a government perspective that asks questions that the governments would like answered, i.e., how much will it cost me to spend on a no regrets action if the hazard doesn't materialize in terms of my capacities to spend on emergency response, for instance? And these sorts of comparative risk analyses have not yet been done to support governments in answering these questions. The biggest one, however, still is finance. The likelihood of a disaster I just mentioned. So this has to do with strengthening scientific systems for forecasting. Policies not having anticipatory action technical capacity. Equipments, yeah, infrastructure as well. And again, in there, I refer you to Pillar 2 of the Early Warning for All initiative. If Early Warning for All has been launched in your country, then reach out to WMO if you're talking about equipment such as weather stations or other things like that, infrastructural developments. Polarized power structures. Yeah. Okay, interesting. So in this next section, I'm going to give you insights from the data on what can be done to address those challenges. I'm running a bit behind on time, but before that, can I please ask you to rank, according to you, what is the most critical challenge to address in your context? So you've got 7 challenges here that I've extracted from the available literature. These are common challenges across different types of contexts with these are fragile contexts, middle income countries, countries which are perhaps in the earlier stages of disaster risk reduction. And different countries will have different ideas on how to prioritize them. But according to you, what is the order in which they should be tackled, really? So the first one is lack of political will or understanding of anticipatory action benefits. The second one would be insufficient funding to actually fuel anticipatory action interventions. The third one is lack of quality data for forecasts and monitoring. There's also coordination gaps within the government themselves, whether that's within the Ministry of Finance, the Met Service, the Ministry of Environment, etc. Others would argue that the gap isn't so much within the governments, but in the fragmentation of anticipatory action pilots, and notably the fragmentation of trigger models for the same hazards. Some people would say that actually the problem is disaster law and policies, that the institutional mandates are restricted and they don't enable governments to act ahead of disasters. And then others would argue that no, the problem is that we've built these AA systems in silos from existing preparedness and contingency plans. So out of the 10 responses so far, the biggest one is insufficient field funding. This is also what has come out of my data when I did the research in Southern Africa, Bangladesh, and also the literature review for other countries. But it was phrased differently. It wasn't so much insufficient fuel funding as the ability of funding mechanisms to quickly transfer money. And actually, most recommendations in the literature ask donors for less fuel funding and more systems building funding. So it's interesting that here in this session, so far the respondents are asking for more fuel funding in terms of critical. Okay, going to move forward to show you some concrete actions that have helped overcome some of these challenges. So here's an example from research I did in Zimbabwe. And I basically took all of my key informer interview and plotted it against the different correlations. So the closer the dot, the closer the correlation. In Zimbabwe, if you look at the top dot, which is the positive impact dot, and you looked at activities that were taken notably by the World Food Programme, but by the AA community at large, the biggest actions that had the most impact on capacities for anticipatory action was strengthening the capacity of the Zimbabwean meteorological departments. WFP partnered with other institutions and had MOUs, memorandums of understanding, to strengthen forecasting capacity, to explain them what trigger models are, and support the digitization of their data. And this strongly then unblocked one of the challenge, which was access to forecast data and reliable forecast data. One of the biggest positive impacts on capacity has been in the implementation side of things. Specifically speaking, one of the things that was done well in Zimbabwe was a participatory approach to anticipatory action. So when the World Food Programme, for instance, was setting up its early action protocol and figuring out which anticipatory actions they wanted to do for drought, they held community-based consultations with local authorities in the pilot districts, where they went to communities and consulted them on what were the needs of communities and what would the communities need 2, 3, 5 weeks ahead of a drought. And in doing so, this really strengthened local capacities for implementation because it created that interconnection between the district, the needs of the communities, and when it came time to actually activate, everybody was involved. So the operational readiness of both the district authorities and the communities in pilot countries was strongly strengthened by this approach. And this became the most frequently mentioned best practice in the data. Other actions that worked well and had that strong impact for Mozambique, if we look at the positive impact, the biggest correlation for Mozambique has been in implementation capacities. And what was done well here, notably, was consulting with government at the very onset of anticipatory action for drought, building on collaborations that already existed between the INGD, INAM, and WMO, the British Red Cross, UK Aid, etc. Here, the World Food Programme signed memorandums of understanding with key institutions to explain how they were going to work together on the first stage to strengthen early warning systems for droughts, and then on the second stage to say, okay, based on these early warning systems, how can we act? How can we implement? And by involving the government early on, rather than going through the alternative approach, which is set up a pilot and then bring the government in, this really strengthened the operational readiness of the government and was cited the most often as a best practice. One thing that Mozambique did particularly well that could potentially be replicable as well is that they seconded, the WFP seconded a government staff to work on anticipatory action. Technically, this means that this staff was salaried both at the National Disaster Risk Management Agency and both paid by through WFP funds. What this created was a focal point, but a bridge that brought the AA perspective into the government, into governmental meetings, into government decisions, discussions, negotiations, revisions of policy, that was equipped and trained to bring those negotiations in. And by seconding it, you also make sure it's not just a one-off training, right? You keep that capacity over time. But more importantly, by seconding that person of interest in government, it brought the government perspective into the discussions on anticipatory action. And it made sure that as the anticipatory action actors were thinking about their trigger models and their forecast-based funding, there was somebody from government present to say whether or not this would work. For instance, whether funding could be automatically triggered, and found out that no, they couldn't, because the financial regulations did not allow the Ministry of Finance to release anticipatory action, and then find other solutions then, for instance, such as setting up a project-specific bank account that would be regulated by the National Disaster Risk Management Agency, while at the same time working on revising policy for that fund. My main point being is that in seconding, you create that bridge between the humanitarian and government world, and you can bridge then the different understandings and perceptions of anticipatory action, with humanitarians saying, this is what is effective in terms of household impact, and government saying, yes, but in our working culture, in our institutions, these are the rules and regulations which we are binded by. Either we change them or you have to work around them. And then create a new, more tailored version of anticipatory action that is better tailored to the context. Running out of time, I do want to leave some time for Q&As. Another example, though, quickly from Madagascar. Best practices here, again, since one of the challenges available data for forecasts, one of the things that international agencies can do is connect national hydromet services to centers of excellence, climate centers of excellence that specialize in exactly that, whether that's the ECWMF at European level. Here in Madagascar, what was done is that the World Food Programme brokered a partnership and paid for memorandum of understanding between the Met Service and the University of Columbia International Research Institute. But there are others. There's also the University of Cape Town in Johannesburg, which had this climate system analysis group. There's RIMES in Asia. International actors are really well placed to broker these kinds of partnerships and say to centers of excellence, look, for AA, this is the ask. This is a service that is needed. And then the centers of excellence can support national Met services in increasing the capacities and systems. So one of the things I want to pull you about is these are examples of actions that were done to strengthen leadership of anticipatory action. But do you have any examples from countries where you have worked in where government has been enabled through specific activities to lead on anticipatory action? And the reason why I ask this is, again, in the interest of shaping the ongoing research on the state of play of government-led anticipatory action, I'm looking for government champions who are leading on anticipatory action to go to these countries and actually ask the governments, what are they doing? What do they need? What's missing? What are barriers, etc. And ideally, these would not be the usual suspects, right? These would not be countries that already have like a wealth of documentation on them. So I'm going to leave a few minutes for that one, because this is really the opportunity for you to influence the direction of the research that the research takes. Feel free as well, if you see a country that you think would be a good case study as a champion for government-led anticipatory action, and not necessarily a champion as well, but it could be different level of maturities to vote on that country to make that more salient. America, I'm going to assume that's the USA. Rwanda and Japan. Japan, really interesting one as well. Um, and does mirror my earlier point in that we said earlier, there was a consensus earlier that governments don't yet understand anticipatory action because it's a fairly new concept. But then you have countries like Japan, who is clearly a lead in emergency evacuations, um, forecasting for multi-hazard complex hazards like earthquakes and tsunamis. And they've been doing it since before anticipatory action was considered a thing. I'm going to put a quick timer on this one to my great regret because I do need to move forward and leave enough space for questions and answers. Eighteen responses so far from the 44 participants.
We also have two in the chat. One is saying Kenya and one Pakistan.
Pakistan, okay, great. Japan and Rwanda are like clear outliers. Italy, interesting. Okay, yeah, Italy has really strong flood early warning systems. Okay, so what I'm seeing as well is that the AA community is interested in hearing on various types of context and maturity, right? From very mature governments in disaster reduction, such as Japan, to um, going through to Mongolia, Philippines, Sri Lanka, China. Interesting. Okay. Okay, so that's time on those responses, but I will duly consider those. And really quickly, before I finish out of time, I want to give you some insights on further recommendations that came out of the research. This research is again ongoing, and once I've finished it for the IFRC, I hope to have a more global overview state of play. But if you look at the screen, sorry, this might be a bit short on your phone, but if you look at the screen, my research in Southern Africa extracted the following best practice lessons learned and opportunities that were replicable from one country to the next. I already mentioned that some replicable best practices are the importance of community participation. This is not specific to anticipatory action. On the literature on systems change, the literature says that if you want a system to change durably, you need to put in a feedback loop from the clients. This sort of implies as well a bit of a mindset shift and different layers of seeing the problem as what do governments need to do anticipatory action, but also from the point of view of the end users or the beneficiaries or the affected populations, what is their ask of the national system? What are they expecting the national system to do? And what is the national system making them do as extra work because it's not functioning correctly? So in Zimbabwe, involving the community participation at the beginning, including the local authorities, this will really help make sure that national systems are more tailored to local needs. Another replicable best practice, if funding is an issue, if channeling funding is an issue and you have to spend time on financial regulations, this could take many, many years. In Mozambique, they did that. They are trying to revise the manual for the National Fund for Disaster Risk Management. But at the same time, they opened a project-specific bank account where they could channel in donor funds that would then be managed by a specific trigger by the National Disaster Risk Management Agency. So that it gives the National Disaster Risk Management Agency a kind of learn by doing with this fund that they can manage, and they can try and activate it based on a trigger while revising longer term their financial regulations. I already mentioned a secondment of national staff to work on anticipatory action. and connecting national hydrometeorological centers to centers of excellence. A key lesson learned, something like that was a common trend across each country, that if actors could do things differently and go back in time, they would do this differently, is on the triggers. If you are working in a country that is starting out on anticipatory action, you have the opportunity now to align with existing triggers, and make sure that if you're working on the same hazard, you can look at what's already being done and not create a new trigger model. Because countries such as Madagascar or Mozambique that had a lot of different pilots for droughts, they now find that this fragmentation of trigger models for droughts is creating issues for integrating anticipatory action into a wider context. Because if everybody's triggering for the same hazard at different points with different justifications, that makes things difficult. It doesn't mean everybody should be using the same threshold, but it should mean that everybody should be understanding at least why they're triggering at different points for a same hazard and what the impacts would be. Another lesson learned is to early on, if you do want to train capacities effectively, one of the most effective way to do that is simulation exercises. As NGO implementers, you should have experience doing simulation exercises. If not, you can reach out to centers who have. OCHA is a really good one. The Red Cross as well has a whole manual on how to do SimExes for anticipatory action. Learning by doing is one of the best way that you can capacitate your local authorities. I don't have time to go to this slide. I will skip this one, unfortunately. Okay, actually, no, let me maybe end on this one, and then open it up to questions. From the literature, when we look at specific activities that can be taken to integrate anticipatory action into national systems, here are 7 activities that kind of aim to tackle the 7 challenges that we mentioned earlier. One of them is disaster law revision and advocacy. Who is positioned well to do that? All the AA implementers with the wealth of evidence that they have, but also the IFRC has the mandate to support government institutions to revise disaster law. And if you're interested in working on them with that, again, I refer you to the disaster law team of the IFRC. Strengthen national hydromet services capacities to forecast and monitor hazards. If you believe that this is an action to be prioritized, then the early warning for all investment initiative could be a good way to start. Reach out to UNDR and WMO. But also, if this is something you want to do, then consider reaching out to environment and development actors, notably actors involved in massive funding pots like the Global Shield or the Green Climate Fund. Strengthen national disaster risk management agencies to use risk information. Again, with this mindset shift of instead of telling national disaster risk management agencies, do AA, ask them, okay, what risk information do you already have? What do you already know? And what do you not know? And help them to layer and get a more complex photograph of what the forecast could be. Some of you might argue that, again, it's not about asking government to do things, but reworking the way that we do things as the AA community. And this relates to internal coordination on AA triggers, more flexible and systems buildings funds from donors could be a key ask. Or finally, do you think that more evidence is needed on the impact of AA to support integration into disaster risk management systems? I will leave it on that slide and I will let you continue to vote on that and open it up to questions. I can stay for another 15 to 20 minutes, so feel free. Also, Ghana, if there are any questions in the Q&A, feel free to let me know.
Yeah, I think no specific questions, but everybody's very happy. And I see some of the colleagues are leaving also from the call. Some people asked you to also share the guidelines and the documents you have shared during this community conversation. There was also some conversations around triggers. So I think there are some colleagues who also had community conversations on the chat.
Okay, great, thanks. So if some of you are feeling a bit shy with questions, you can also feel free to add any other thoughts, comments, questions. I'll stay on for a little longer as well. This could be either key messages or questions you want answered or just comments. Again, this is the opportunity for you as well to influence the research that I will be leading on government-led anticipatory action. So I'm happy for your inputs, but I also know that that's time. So yeah, feel free. I see Daniel Riquet from FAO has a hand. So yeah, please feel free to take the floor again. This is flexible now.
Thanks, Kim. We are starting to struggle with a key issue. I don't know if that has been also like identified in other regions, but in recently we've tried to find evidence on the added value of anticipatory action versus early response. Or I mean, there could be a lot of ways and angles to do this analysis to eventually convince and work with government on anticipatory action. They are all asking for evidence. And to our surprise, we found nearly zero evidence in Asia and the Pacific. And we have so many experience in anticipatory action, so many actors in the region. But when we looked at the evidence base, it was extremely, extremely thin. And I have the impression that if we want to convince a government to take the risk to act early, we need to be able to tell them, yeah, using cash before the flood make a difference versus giving cash immediately after the flood. So if we are not able to provide this set of evidence, I think we are going to have difficulties to get the government really involved. They will probably try to focus on certain hazard that maybe like slow onset because the risk is perhaps less for them. So I mean that's I don't know what is my question, but do we have the same perhaps concern and issue in other regions? We are going to work on this evidence strongly in the coming months in Asia and the Pacific. But I think it's something that we really need as a community of practice to work on, because if we can't really provide concrete and you know a good set of evidence, it will remain perhaps a wish to have government developing anticipatory action system. We see in some countries government telling the humanitarian community to trigger, which is great, but we don't see government spending money and really developing anticipatory action for different sectors at risk. So just a quick comment and yeah, a bit of a question is it something that we also see in other regions or globally? Over.
So in my experience doing research in Southern Africa, the response was that the evidence is available, at least at household level, about different impacts of, for instance, cash, mitigative impacts included, but that it's not being packaged necessarily in a way that makes sense to governments. The evidence is saying the cash was sent on time and it mitigated this impact versus if you had done it to emergency response, which is great for the communities. But it's not telling governments, this is how much it would have cost you if it had been a false alarm. This is what you do in case of false alarm. If you have a false alarm, then and you still do anticipatory reaction, it's still going to be okay for your emergency response capacities. That's not something that is currently available in the literature, the financial implications of anticipatory action. I assume you're familiar with the foundational document. I think it's Emily Wilkinson or Lena Weingartner from WFP called the Evidence Base on Anticipatory Action, in which you have a lot of household level impact. It's basically a literature review of how the evidence is currently being packaged, and it has a list as well of different evidence documents, including a study on the impact, the mitigative impact of cash in Bangladesh using counterfactuals and in Nepal, if I'm not mistaken, which seem to answer some of your questions somewhat. And then, yeah, but otherwise your point is exactly why the RFRC has asked me to conduct more research as well. Not so much on evidence on impact, but to ask the question, why is currently no documentation of what governments have done to anticipate, and how has that been better or worse for emergency response?
Maybe, Kim, just a quick point. We had
Yeah.
this discussion this morning with Raymond from IFRC. He was stressing and I like his logic. He was stressing that a lot of post-activation documentation provided by agencies are focusing on, can we do anticipatory action? Which I think now is quite clear. We can do anticipatory action for rapid and onset events, for typhoon, flood, etc. But exactly what you said, I mean, giving the evidence that the government want, not on the feasibility, but on the impact of anticipatory action, is perhaps what we need to prioritize collectively. So I think some agencies are still perhaps looking at the feasibility, and it's maybe time now that we move to the next set of evidence, looking at the actual added value and impacts of anticipatory action. Just a quick point.
Okay, interesting. I would argue that depends who you mean by we, because in the literature so far, when you ask, yes, we can do anticipatory action, we know it. And yes, it does work, we know it. But if you're saying can we governments do anticipatory action, then some of the literature is actually saying maybe to focus on slow onset hazards, because the systems are slower in disaster risk reduction. And the slow onset hazards, such as drought or anything else, for instance, can allow more time for a soft trigger with discussion-based elements, and that could be more palatable to governments. So that's on whether we can do anticipatory action. It depends who is we in your question. And when it comes to what is actually the impact of anticipatory action, if you're not familiar, again, I refer you to the document called the Evidence Based on Anticipatory Action, and I can share it with you, in which the cash-based study in Bangladesh, and I'm sure you've seen it, but it actually asked that question, like, what would have been the impact had we not sent cash in an anticipatory manner? And again, this is few and far between, and definitely more needs to be done on household level impact, but I think that could already serve as a basis if that's what you were looking for. In terms of actual mitigative impact, anticipatory versus emergency response. Maureen, yes?
Yeah, thank you, Kim, for some very, very good insights into what you've presented. I mean, I really hope we can access some of the insights that you have presented so that we can use this in our work going forward. Maybe just to voice what I had put in the chat, that I totally agree with Demia, that we really do need evidence enough to convince governments, especially if you're saying governments, can you put this in your budgets? We need to convince the governments that it makes sense, that it will save them physical costs of responding after the fact with some hard facts around that, so that they can really, really get it into their policies, into their budgets and all of that. But then, like as I was saying in the chat, evidence is a bit of a tricky one, at least from my experience, because while we're asking for evidence, we also need to have done something on anticipatory action in terms of building the systems and evaluating how well the system is working, delivered some actions, and again, asking the question around, did this action perform better than if we had responded, so that we can actually generate this evidence. But I think part of the struggle that we are having is that while some evidence is being generated, again, as per what this evidence based on AA said back then, part of the struggle is that we are using different ways of measuring the evidence. We are answering different questions when we are generating the evidence. So consolidating it into a convincing case to governments, I think, is a struggle. But perhaps if we, and I mean the AA community, be it humanitarian development, government, or whoever, if perhaps we could start to agree on common ways of generating this evidence, perhaps we can start to generate something that is more robust, more comparable, basically answering the same kinds of questions, no matter what agency is actually delivering the actions. And hopefully we can start to generate more robust evidence to convince governments. Thanks.
Thanks, Maureen.
And on that, Kim, perhaps if this is something that you could investigate, like what's the interest for people to have like common ways of generating evidence and what it would take, that would be really interesting to know. Thanks.
Right, thank you, Maureen. I know that there's also a technical working group, which I think you're in the Anticipation Hub, that looks at standardizing evidence, so duly noted on that. I would also argue that this work does need to happen on standardizing evidence, but also if you're working on anticipatory action in a country and you're trying to get government to do anticipatory action, and you're thinking, okay, what evidence can I do to influence them? Then perhaps that is a massive challenge to influence government to do something that they A, don't understand, B, don't necessarily want to do, 3, would be in big trouble for doing. And then that puts a lot of pressure indeed on you to come with that evidence because you have all these fears and risks. I would argue that a different way of seeing it, without again saying that deprioritizing the importance of evidence, we do need to work on that. But if you're in a country and you're interested in supporting the government and anticipating, then instead of thinking what is the hard evidence that I can bring, or just thinking that, I think the question would be more to like, what is government already doing that is anticipatory in nature, not specifically AA, and then that releases the burden of hard AA evidence, but what is government already doing to anticipate? How is the government already using risk information in my context? And how can I support them to either use more risk information, i.e. more reliable forecasts or overlay forecasts with exposure and vulnerability, or to take decisions? Or what are actions that they take where they're already they already have a culture of preparedness, for instance, like whether that's WASH or food security interventions. Your country has a culture of investing in preparedness, of pre-positioning things, of working with humanitarians, etc., to give rapid response. Would it make sense? And how can I support the government, if it does make sense, to shift those rapid response actions into the anticipation phase? With which investment in preparedness, with which investment early warning? And then, yes, you do need a bit of evidence to suggest that then it would be better in that phase. But yeah, I think that if you go to system strengthening with the view of changing the way the government work, then the burden on the evidence is going to be huge, and the case for anticipatory action is going to be very difficult to make because a government will always be risk averse, and anticipatory action is about working with risk and probability. So rather than also looking at what is the available evidence, Damien, as well, in your specific country, I think there is something to be said about mapping out what's already being done in that country and either strengthening specific components, and maybe in the long term that will enable AA, or then looking at specific actions that are already existing in this country for rapid response, and then focusing the evidence effort on that specific action. What would be the comparative impact? Whether that's cash or early warnings or evacuations or vaccinations, whatever. It does require from the AA community to shift their mindset a little bit from how do we take this pilot and integrate it and ask governments to do it to, okay, so what are my governments already doing that then I can work around, and what are elements of the system I can tweak to enable more anticipatory actions? And then you work with government willingness as well by working on their strong points and see what their priorities are as well for capacity strengthening. If you're able to show to governments like these are your strong points and these are the weaker points of your system, then you should meet with less resistance when it comes to strengthening these aspects of that system before even asking them to implement and release funds. Just showing them that within the disaster risk management continuum, you can move up the pyramid from after the shock to before the shock. And on that, Damien will share with you as well a resource by Zoe Scott, which has recommendations on how to get governments to shift from reactive finance to anticipatory finance, which is really good.
Perfect. Kim, sorry to interrupt, but I think we're running out of time.
Right.
Thank you very much for everything and everyone to join and to discuss with us. We will upload it, and I hope to see you again soon in our next community conversations. And everyone have a good day. And
Oh, sorry, one last point.
yeah.
Sorry, one last point I really want to address. How will the result of our discussion be shared with governments? I hope there were government representatives in the room here today, because I know some of them are members of the hub. There will be members of the governments at the Global Dialogue platform, and this will be shared with them. And in the case study that I'm doing and the research that we're doing, I'll be discussing and consulting with governments. So that's how it's going to be shared. Thanks. Over. Last point from me.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. That's great. And with that, I would close our meeting. And yeah, have a good day, everyone. Thank you.